just give you guys a little bit of background or kind of like lead up to this, like a couple housekeeping things. We are planning on having 2 more webinars here this spring. One's going to be with Jerry and Vic and Jeremy again, as we continue to learn about the foundational Devons. And then we're going to have another one. Pretty much I discussed with some of the board members kind of some hacks and some tips and tricks that we've learned from each other that we can share. And I kind of want that one to be more of like open dialogue with all the attendees, as well as, I mean, there really isn't going to be a panelist. I am going to prepare like a PowerPoint with some pictures and stuff of just things I get from our board members. But just want to openly share. I think we have the opportunity to learn from each other, and it doesn't seem to matter who I talk to in this association. Someone's doing something just a little bit different, maybe a little bit easier and a little more beneficial. So we want to touch on that. And there's a good chance that still trying to gather some information, Vic and Jerry, and we're trying to nail down a date. So I think it's probably going to switch to where the third one's going to be the tips and tricks and the farm hacks, and then Jerry and them will probably be maybe beginning of May if we can get everything together and be prepared for that. So it's just a little bit of lead up, just give you guys an idea. I talked to Darren, and he's an expert here with and he's a vet, and I just kind of want to talk to him about the natural approach of vaccines. I think we can go too far in both directions, and so we're just kind of trying to look at the balance here. I mean, you can not vaccinate, and then you can have issues, and then it's going to be too late to try to treat it. And I think you can, some of the extensions and stuff maybe push a little bit too hard on vaccinating everything. So where's that balance at? And that's kind of where I asked Darren to help us out with. So I'll give it up to you, Darren. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being a speaker. Appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, and my pleasure. Thanks, AJ, for inviting me on here. And going as we go through this, I do have some slides. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute, but I welcome dialogue. I don't necessarily just need to talk the whole time, but I do have some stuff prepared that I think will be beneficial. But if there's a way to raise your hand or speak up, don't be afraid to do that. I purposely brought some coffee along with me. One, it keeps my whistle wet, and secondly, it gives you a chance to maybe interject as I pause, and keeps me from maybe running too fast. So
yeah, and you bring up a good point. If anybody has any questions, feel free. There is a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen there. You can click on that. You can send me individual chat, or you could send a group of chat, so Darren will be able to see as well. So
sure.
Yeah, thanks, Darren.
Yeah, so I'm going to try sharing my screen here, and hopefully this all goes right. How are we looking, AJ? All right, well, I'll get started here, and if there's any issues with my screen showing or something like that, please reach out and let me know.
Yeah, sorry, Darren. Everything looks good there. I forgot that I muted myself.
No problem. No problem at all. I understand. So today I was going to talk a little bit about managing disease risk in livestock, and specifically AJ and I were talking about the benefits, or at least the benefit of having a discussion about vaccines, right? So as we look into kind of some of the costs, the benefits, some of these type of things, it's pretty easy for veterinarians or people in education, universities and stuff like that, to make large blanket recommendations. And there's some reasons for that. But in general, when we just give someone a sheet of paper that tells them what to do, vaccinate at weaning, booster 4 weeks later, some of these things, it becomes a little bit cookie cutter, right? And that's okay for some people. That's actually all some people want, right? They don't want to think about it and they just want to be told what to do. But the problem with that, I find, is that when if we don't educate around it, if people don't understand the reasons and some of the risks, even just on a fairly superficial level, those things are easy to remove when, maybe money's tight or labor's short, and it's, especially when you have the friend down the road or somebody that says, I've never had a problem in 20 years and I never vaccinate. And or around here, we say that if you're going to have livestock, you'll have dead stock sooner or later. And the guy that's never had problems either hasn't done it long enough or he's lying. So we all, myself included, and I raise cattle, so we all end up from time to time dealing with, something in our herd. So let's talk a little bit about. Well, let me move here to the next slide. Oh, I forgot I was going to put this in here. So I got my doctorate in veterinary medicine in 2009 at Michigan State University. I currently live in Central Michigan. I'm part of a 9-doctor large animal practice, ambulatory practice, so we travel all over. I'm married to my wife, Amber. We have 4 great children, and we farm on the side as a family. And we got into Devon's in 2015. So I'm one of you, not as long as some of you, but I consider myself one of you. So conflict of interest statement, I basically have no conflict of interest. We are not affiliated with any vaccine company. I specifically am not, and I don't receive any financial incentive for the products I recommend. So back to our discussion. These are some topics we're gonna go over in fairly briefly today. We talked quite a bit about a natural approach to farming, and I'm all for that. But what does that mean versus natural with management? And maybe we're actually more of a natural with management, and do vaccines have a place in that? So then, risk and cost of disease, immunity in cows, cost versus the benefit of prevention, types and timing of vaccines, and we're going to just briefly touch on deworming. So all of these could really be a webinar in themselves, right? So we're gonna, for 30 to 45 minutes, we're gonna go pretty superficial on some of this. And like I said, the idea is to give you a background for why I would encourage you to consider vaccines, and then which ones, and how far to go down that path. So in this idea of natural versus natural with management, we think of natural, right? And you think of survival of the fittest. There's predators, there's disease, there's grazing, certainly. You think of historically, what did grazing livestock look like? And there's a lot of benefits there. There's a lot of things that we can take and try to mimic. Certainly, it looks a lot different than feedlots, right? But at the same time, there's things we don't want, right? We don't run all our bulls and young bulls together and just say, survival of the fittest, nature will work it out. And I recognize some people do, but a lot of people wouldn't recommend that. We tend to try to utilize the benefits we see in a natural environment and manage them, right? So we rotationally graze, but we use fences. We use specific bulls to manage our genetics. We don't just rely on survival of the fittest. We use breeding seasons because that helps us manage productivity. And we use guardian dogs to protect livestock. But what about disease? And the natural way to limit a herd, or well, specifically in this case, to limit herds, is either spreading out, right? They would spread out to bigger areas, or predators and disease. And those are the primary ways that are naturally limited. Herds are naturally limited. So I do want to say specifically that I know, and I recognize this for sure, that there are lots of factors that affect disease, and right? And it's not just whether or not we vaccinate. So We limit disease by how we move cattle, by their overall health, by biosecurity. So there's a number of things we can do outside of injectables, right? And certainly we should do those, but we'll talk about some of the risks we still have. So certainly there are quite a few diseases that are still around us. We still find them from time to time. We test for them, we find them. When we have, for example, trailering, we have a lot of our farms have quite a few starlings. Of course, you see that more in confinement operations, but they're still around, and a lot of us are surrounded by confinement operations, right? That's pretty popular. So feed yards of one type or another, dairy systems, starlings, our boots, what's on the bottom of our boots. A lot of us either farm or know people that farm or work in agriculture, right? So we're exposed to other farms, and how many of those do we bring home with us? Shows, great things where we're doing everything we can to keep an animal healthy and looking great, but yet it's still an area where there's a mass coming together from multiple farms. So disease is costly both as an incident and as a potential lost income. And the cost of an antibiotic is expensive. Veterinary costs, I recognize those aren't cheap. And then what's the potential loss? A dead cow, a conception rate problem, and potentially abortions. Where do those costs, where they add up pretty quick? And this third statement, it might seem a bit strong, but how will loss affect you? And can you afford an abortion storm? And sometimes with lepto disease in a naive herd, you can have up to 30% death loss in your calf crop. And obviously it's not always that extreme, but are we ready to take that chance? And lepto is common, right? Lepto tends to be found. We'll get into diseases a little bit more later, but it tends to be found in groundwater, spread by animals, wild animals. So if you've got ponds, standing water, things like that, your cows are potentially susceptible to lepto. Potential loss of sales. So some people have a market for antibiotic-free beef, and then once an animal has to be treated for disease of any type, if it's an antibiotic, they're pulled from the program. So that's a potential loss of income if the market is a different market it has to go to. So these are some, obviously there's risk. Even what is your prevailing wind? What farms are around you? So we are associated with risk. Our farms are associated with risk, and certainly there's a cost to disease when it happens. So immunity in cows, I like to think of cows as have a balance, like a scale, right? So a cow is on one side, and on the other side is this the environment it lives in, right? And it's just perfectly balanced the majority of the time, right? Thankfully. So we have this fantastic thing called an immune system that God gave us. God gave cows, right? And you hear some people say, well, I'm not going to vaccinate because God gave them an immune system, and there's a point to that, but I think we can do more, and I think we do run some risks that can be alleviated if we potentially vaccinate. So if a cow's on one side and she's in balance with her environment is a combination of stress and bacteria, viruses that she's associated with, that she's familiar with in her environment, right? That's why we like to give calves colostrum from their own moms. Yeah, we can buy it in a bag, but that cow is growing up in an environment that calf is now going to live in, right? So they develop an immunity to the environment they're in. The fact that you may have never lost a cow to disease doesn't mean that your environment doesn't have disease, right? It's around you. Chances are it's on your farm. And there's a balance that takes place between the level of bacteria or virus in an area and the cow's immune system. So in a healthy cow, even a vaccinated cow, right, we can generally overcome that immune system and tip the scale, right, if we add more virus, more bacteria, more stress. These are the things that start tipping the scale, and the cow will potentially have more trouble keeping up. So if the bacteria and viruses are around you, and they are, and your cow has her own immune system, right? Well, why not just rely on that? So there's different types of immunity, and a cow will expose. So two things, right? So if it's already in the environment, a cow should be exposed to it and have a good immunity to it and be able to balance it unless it becomes out of hand in the environment. But what we also see is that some cows aren't familiar with what they get exposed to, either through shows, transportation, purchased cattle, etc. And then they have to respond to a specific disease, bacteria, or virus. What happens when the immune system is exposed to something new is it takes a little bit of time to ramp up. Now it's pretty quick, but what happens is initially the response is less specific. And when we vaccinate, what we're able to do is create specific antibodies to specific antigens, and that cow, her immune system will recognize those when they show up. It makes the response quicker and more robust when it happens in real life, right? So that's, and we know, I mean, we've all been through COVID and the pandemic and everything. We know vaccines aren't perfect. In fact, some of the vaccines we have in livestock, that's even what we'll say is, it's not going to necessarily prevent disease, but it limits the symptoms of the disease. It's less severe and more treatable. And sometimes that's a win all in itself, because some of these diseases can be pretty terrible, really. So your cows may be exposed and have antibodies to specific viruses and bacteria and viruses in the environment. But what about new things, right? So given enough growth, we can overwhelm a healthy cow's immune system. So it is a balance, and that's why we talked about vaccines are not the only thing, right? So biosecurity, cow health, feed quality, there's so many factors that play into it, and that's important. In fact, I was telling AJ the other night, I don't know how many times guys have said to me, when we're dealing with a problem on a farm, man, I'm not done anything different. We've done it the same way for years. And potentially that's true, and there are so many factors that affect the health of a cow, so many factors on the other side of the scale that when we can do one more thing to tip the scale in their favor, such as a vaccine, I think it can sometimes pay remarkable dividends. So I'm not talking about things that break the bank here. Cost of vaccinating. Now I know there's hidden costs. It takes time, but as far as cost of product, a modified live, and we're going to get into some of the types of vaccines, modified live versus killed vaccines, and etc. But just to start off here, a modified live viral vaccine. So your primary viral vaccine with lepto is about $2.50 a dose. That's a combination, so that's a single injection. Clostridial vaccines, which we'll talk about those also, they're about $1 a dose. Now, these are going to vary based on the company. They're going to vary based on your veterinarian's markup, right? And so there's going to be variation in this but it should be fairly simple. So historically, veterinarians, and you may be aware of this, but historically veterinarians made far more money off the products they sold and marked up than they did off their hourly rate, their hourly wage. Over time, that has balanced out and gone a long ways in the other direction with the companies now out there like Animar and some of these companies that have taken route trucks directly to farms. They began undercutting veterinarians severely, which is fine. But what it did is it drove up cost of veterinary service, but it brought the cost of products way down. So the cost to have a vet out might not have changed much, but the cost of product certainly has in a lot of cases. So that's still a little bit veterinarian dependent, so your markup is going to vary, but you should be somewhere in the ballpark of $2.50 and $1. So that's $3.50. We'll get into this too, but the first time they get it, they need a booster. After that, it becomes an annual vaccine. So that's an annual expense per cow, which is pretty reasonable. How many times, like in your herd? So in your herd, one way I like to look at this is depending on the cows you have and depending on the way you market your product, how many times can you vaccinate before you meet the cost associated with one pregnancy loss? You know, I was talking to someone back a while ago, and they had a cow that was almost full term, lost the calf, and just, you know, like, wow, don't know why, never happened before type thing. And these are the type of things we're talking about. And so that's kind of one way to look at it. The benefit of vaccination include potential decreased incidence of both viral and secondary bacterial disease, and a decreased antibiotic use. And we talked about potentially having to remove cattle from a program. Healthier livestock, shorter calving window, increased conception rates. So we don't always think of that. Like we think of, you know, treating calves or cows and things that may or may not die. But what about your calving window, your conception rates? So those things can all be affected. Any questions? Don't be afraid to jump in. So types of vaccines. The first primary vaccine that I recommend is a viral vaccine. It's a 5-way viral vaccine, and it has lepto combined with it. So I referred to that a little bit ago. This is your primary viral diseases affecting cattle. They respond poorly to treatment and can have a costly outcome. So when I recommend vaccines, and AJ referred to this, like there are a lot of vaccines out there. Which ones you need, and this is why I recommend also talking with your veterinarian. I hadn't said that yet, but different farms will have different levels of risk associated with them. And this, you know, you need to kind of design this with your veterinarian. He knows what he's seeing in the area, and hopefully knows a little bit about your operation as well. So some of these things, you know, there's more that can be done, but as a general rule, I think most veterinarians will recommend your primary viral vaccine. So specifically, I'm talking about things that either don't treat well, right? They don't respond well to treatment, or they have a costly outcome, or both. So specific diseases in that viral vaccines are IBR, BRSV, PI3, and type 1 and 2 BVD. So IBR is infectious bovine rhinotracheitis, and BRSV is bovine respiratory syncytial virus. Those two combined actually tend to run their course, get better, and you think, well, what's the big deal then? They don't generally cause abortions. The problem with those two is they tend to become like kind of a trifecta. A lot of times you have IBR, you may find BRSV, not always, but you can. They can kind of piggyback on each other. Also, piggybacking with both of them, you'll often get bacterial pneumonia on top of it. So you'll have a viral component, a bacterial component. We know the virus side of things don't treat well. Viruses don't generally respond to antibiotics. Bacteria do. So those, we may treat them and they may get better, but it's more those ones, and they can certainly be some cases that are really serious, but those, there's a cost associated with treatment, right? And those can be quite high, and the viral component can certainly spread. PI3, well, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The two I was talking about was PI3 and BRSV. Those are the ones that tend to work together. IBR is the one that does cause abortions, okay? So it's a respiratory and abortion, and then BVD on the end. See, I got them out of order, so I apologize for that. BVD on the end, that one also causes abortions. BVD specifically can be a real problem for herds. If you're familiar with it, you understand this, but if you haven't, I just want to briefly tell you that BVD, bovine viral diarrhea virus, I'm less worried about the diarrhea listed in the name, right? And I'm more concerned about what it does to pregnancies specifically. So a cow, BVD is associated with something called a PI, which is a persistently infected animal. So cows that are exposed to BVD while they are pregnant, and usually approximately 80 to 120 days in gestation, right? The calf that's developing at that 80 to 120 days is learning what is normal. It's developing its immune system and learning what is normal, like what is itself, right? So what happens is when a calf gets exposed to a virus that its mom has while it's 80 to 120 days in utero, it experiences this virus and it accepts it as normal. So what happens then is a cow, this calf is born. We call these PI calves. They have the virus in their system. Their body sees it as normal, and they never mount an immune response to it. So you can imagine you've got this perfect incubator. It's about 101 degrees in there. It's moist, and this virus replicates extremely high levels, and they shed it in the environment. They're kind of a typhoid Mary. So this PI then sheds enormous amounts of virus into the environment. It affects the cattle it's around. It stresses the cattle it's around because of the response they must create, the response is created on their own immune system. And then there's certainly a risk if they're still around next year, right? When cows are pregnant again. Now they're the one potentially spreading it to cows and developing new persistently infected animals. The problem is these guys don't look sick, right? I mean, they don't. A lot of times they're perfectly healthy. Now they won't live a long life, but you might get them up a year or 2 years of age before they break with it. Certainly some far sooner, but not always. So these are the things that are costly long term, and BVD can cause, depending when it happens, it can cause abortions as well. So it depends where in the stage of gestation that those cows are exposed to it. So yeah, go ahead.
To follow up with that one, are you gonna go into the timing of when you should give that, and like before they're pregnant or during, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
What time is it? Let's see. Oh yeah, we're doing okay.
6:30.
So yep. So I am going to get into that here in just a little bit. So those are the primary viruses that we vaccinate against. They come in a combination, easy to do, and the risk associated with not doing them can be high. Lepto is usually combined with this product. Now you can get, if you see the bottom of the screen there, BovaShield Gold. They also have a BovaShield Gold 5, and it does not have the lepto. That's fine if you're just raising steers. Lepto is a problem in production animals, specifically heifers and cows. But as I referred to a little bit ago, lepto is commonly found in groundwater. It's spread through other animals, specifically wild animals, rodents, things like that. Lepto also, as we referred to earlier, can cause abortion storms of up to 30%. It can, but it has a broader range than that. So it can also cause abortion. It can cause early abortion. So what happens when in those cases, these cows potentially get bred, and then they show up open in 30 some days, 40 some days. It's not like a normal cycle, like an open cow that got missed, right? They potentially got pregnant, they lose the pregnancy. So they have this irregular return to estrus, we call it, and that's usually associated with a loss for some reason. So it can happen early on, all through pregnancy, and then they can even deliver calves. Sometimes these calves are born weak, but they're still born, but there's problems with the calves. It can even affect milk production, right? So this is a pretty big economic factor for cow-calf operations.
So the other one there you have, Darren, that's a Triangle product, Triangle 10.
Yep. So that's where I've got actually a bunch of slides coming up with vaccines, multiple vaccines. So we'll circle back. Triangle 10 on the right is a killed vaccine, but it's a viral lepto combination. And the Bove Shield here on the left side of the screen is also a viral lepto, but it's a modified live. And we'll get into the benefits of each one, kind of how to make that decision. So I think I said the two vaccines I recommend back a little bit ago. So the one is the viral lepto combination, and the other is a Clostridial vaccine. Clostridium tends to be found in the soils. It's important because when we try to treat it, it doesn't respond well. And so we often, if it's a true Clostridial problem, we tend to lose cows. And so much so that sometimes we don't even know there's a problem until we find them dead. So it's fast. And as I alluded to a couple screens ago, the vaccine's $1, right? So I've seen this before. And what tends to happen is we end up at a farm trying to figure out what's going on. We identify a Clostridial problem. If it's not being vaccinated for, 9 times out of 10, these guys are happy to do it, but it's just too late, right? But once they've seen it, they recognize that it was something worth doing. Additional vaccines are available. So this goes back into what AJ talked about and what I referred to a few minutes ago. Like if there's specific risks on your farm, there are specific diseases that we can vaccinate for that I'm not talking about tonight. There's a Salmonella vaccine. There's a Clostridium type A vaccine, which is different than what I'm referring to here, and it tends to cause a hemorrhagic bowel disease. There are other specific things we can target. And if you have that problem, it's certainly worth doing. But a lot of people don't. And my goal tonight is not to get you to, jump in the deep end. I don't even think it's necessary on a lot of farms. But my goal is to talk a little bit about the risks and some of the, like AJ talked about, what's the happy medium? What can we talk about? What would we recommend that's generally recommended for everybody and is worth the effort?
Hey, Darren, I do have a question here from Carolyn. She says, how would you know if your animal had Clostridial overgrowth?
Okay, good question. I think we would have gotten to it a little bit, but let's just deal with it right now. So one of the Clostridiums, so tetanus is a Clostridium, and we can do combination vaccines that include tetanus. We almost always recommend tetanus if we're banding cattle. So that's actually one thing I didn't even put in here because it's not your general annual herd health type vaccine, but certainly we do recommend a tetanus vaccine when we're cutting or banding. It's generally found in the environment. It's in the soil, right? So when we create a wound on the bottom side of an animal, they're certainly at risk for it. Also, it doesn't treat. I've seen it before, and there's very rare the cases that you will save once you have identified the fact that they have tetanus, right? So those almost always end up in death. The vaccine's a little bit more expensive, but it's still economical. And so I do recommend that for all calves that are going to get cut or banded. Also, if it's in the environment, if you've had it on your farm, there's a good chance you'll get it again. It lives in the soil a long time. And also if horses have been on your farm, if that was an area that had horses tend to have and carry tetanus more than cattle did. But if there was a history of them being there, your cattle are at higher risk. So back to the other one, the Clostridium specifically. So there are a bunch of so Clostridium, I think this one is a 7 or 8 way that I've got here in my notes. If you include tetanus, I think it's up to about 9. So there are multiple different types of Clostridium. The two that are probably in my areas at most at risk, at least, one is blackleg. Blackleg is Clostridial spores that get into the muscle. And we tend to see that sometimes it kind of shows itself, when you got groups of cattle that have been combined. So you see it sometimes in feedlots, right? You get these big steers that start shoving each other around, but we know our cows do that too. And we get bruising, and those Clostridial spores really take off. And those blackleg can be so sudden that you just find dead cows. It's identified by taking muscle samples and where the bruising is, and a lot of times, if that's the case, they'll find it. So those ones are quick, which is not helpful for anybody, but certainly it encourages people to vaccinate, which is, good, but never good to go through those situations. The other one we see sometimes is malignant edema. So I've seen this before in a case where a cow was, so we'll sometimes see this basically around under the tail, around the vulva of a cow. And it's usually associated with post-calving trauma, and Clostridium gets into that tissue and they swell up something terrible. And those ones don't respond well to antibiotics. And I'm thinking of a specific farm I dealt with this, and it was one of those ones that wasn't post-calving, which is when you usually see it, but the reasons fit. I think it had recently been in heat, and so there must have been some trauma there. And whatever all the situation, it was presented differently than normal, but the reasons were kind of all starting to line up, and we tried treating that animal and we weren't able to save it. So some of these Clostridiums are treatable. Okay, so we'll see Clostridial overgrowth sometimes in calves, and you'll get like bellies, little bloated bellies on like bottle calves, and those ones are generally treatable. But some of the ones that I'm referring to are the ones that are more insidious and definitely harder to treat.
I got Bob on here. He was going to ask a question as well.
Sure, go ahead. You want me to come back to that?
Yeah, you can come back to that.
Bob, if you can hear me, jump in whenever. So types of vaccines, we talked a little bit about modified live versus killed vaccines. And that is referring to the vaccine itself. So what we're exposing that cow to. So a modified live has a component of that vaccine that is actually live. Okay. And the benefits of those is they're more effective, they work better. Believe it or not, they're cheaper. So not many things are better and cheaper, right? But this is one. The downside of it is they require more management. So when we give a modified live vaccine, a lot of times you look on the side of that bottle, it'll say safe for pregnant cows if, and that's a big if they've received 2 doses, so your initial dose and your booster, that's what gets you your high level of antigen or antibody in the system. So if they've received 2 doses prior to becoming pregnant, they say technically you can give it. So I just don't. I think there's still some risk there, and there's other options. So that's my opinion on it. So a modified live vaccine is, in my opinion, a vaccine to put in the period between calving and breeding. A killed vaccine is safe for all cows, regardless of where they are at in their stage of gestation. So some of this is going to depend on management, and a couple of reasons. So hopefully I can say this without muddying the waters too much. But the other thing is calves, right? So at weaning, a lot of times we give calves a vaccine. You don't want to give a modified live vaccine to a calf that is still nursing on a pregnant cow. So because of the level of virus, it's not a lot, but it's a modified live, so the level of virus that circulates and is shed. So and we talked about the fact that the virals, there's some that are, we don't want them because they cause secondary bacterial problems, but the other ones cause abortions, right? So we don't want to give this to that cow or her calf that's still nursing her because of the virus that it circulates in the system and is spread in the environment at that time. So there's a couple ways to do this. Some people just don't, right? So maybe there's too much intermingling between calves that need vaccines and cows, if it's not a tightly managed calving interval, or maybe they calve spring and fall and there's just too much circulation, then some of those are just safe for going with the killed vaccine. It is slightly more, but the risk is less, right? And that's worth it. The benefits of the modified live are there if you can fit it into your management system, right? So the other thing is some people don't want to handle cows very often, so they're not handling them until the vet comes to do preg checks. And at that point, they're pregnant or not. That's, if you want to vaccinate, then you need a killed vaccine. That's safe to do. And we have farms that do that, and that's fine. But the modified live, like I said, works better. So if you can put it into your program in a way that works for you, you'll get slightly better effects, and it's cheaper. I've got timing here coming up in just a minute. We'll get into that a little more. Okay, so these are just 3 examples. There are lots of companies out here that produce these products. If it's from any of the top reputable companies like Boehringer Ingelheim, sorry, that was a tough one to say. In fact, I went to a conference for that company one time, and the first speaker out had a whole slide or slide sets on just how to pronounce their name, right? We call it BI, it's a lot easier. But BI is a good name, Merck is a good name, Zoetis is a good name. There's a lot. So if you're pulling from these top tier companies, I don't have a problem with it. They have research and development. There's a lot of research that goes into these products, and they're good products, right? We tend here just to use a fair bit of Zoetis and some Merck, and BI. We use a fair bit of BI. So the ones I've got up here on the side of the screen there with the black and white calf, that's a Bovishield Gold FP505. So that's your viruses and your leptos, right? So that's what we talked about. The one in the middle is a Bovishield Gold 5. That would be for someone that's raising steers, right? It's the viruses, but no lepto. Lepto is important for breeding females, and you can save a few bucks if you don't need it. But I do want to say too, the leptos are fine for steers. So if you got a small farm and it's just easier to buy one product, get the one with lepto in it. No problem at all. This one on the right, that's Vista. That's a Merck product. Same thing. It's your viruses and your leptos. But these are modified live. Okay. Modified live all require you to mix them. If you open those boxes, I didn't include a picture of this. There's 2 bottles. It's your diluent and your powder. You have to mix them. Once you mix them, that vaccine is good for about 2 hours, right? So it's not uncommon for us to go to a farm, and maybe we're waiting for a minute, right? So we open the refrigerator and there's this mixed up product from who knows when, right? It's garbage. It really is. It doesn't last that long. And in the heat and the sun, it's even less. So I think they say maybe up to 4 hours in cool weather. So it is something that has to be used up pretty quick. Don't store it in the fridge. It's no good after you mix it. The difference here with killed is most of the killed products come in a tank. So that means as long as it's not expired and you do what you can to use clean needles, you should always use clean needles. Those products you can just keep pulling out of that jug repeatedly. The difference is Cattle Master, which is Zoetis's product, and that one's still a mix. But on the far right is Triangle 10. We talked about that a little bit ago. That's a BI product. It's your virals and your leptos, but it's a killed one. Middle is Cattle Master, viral and lepto, and on the far left it's Virus Shield. That one's Elenco, another good name with good products, and that's again a killed combination vaccine. So I'm not pushing products, guys. I don't get a dime for it. If it helps you see what somebody's using that works, and that's the benefit. If your vet's using something different, no problem. These are Clostridium vaccines. Again, there's an example of Merck, BI, and Zoetis, and they're all very similar. AJ had a question about Enforce. So for those of you that are familiar with it, it's an not familiar with it, it's an intranasal. It specifically has some of the same components as your virus vaccine. So bovine rhinotracheitis, PI3, and BRSV. So your three that we referred to earlier. It does not cover you against any of the BVD, which is what causes PIs, persistently infected problems. But where we tend to see this is if someone's going to vaccinate really young calves, they might use this instead of an injectable. The other place we use it a lot is prior to a stressor. So dairies use it quite a bit. So they wean their calves and group house them, right? So we know that's a stress when the environment changes and the whole hierarchy changes. They have to establish who's boss, you know. So those are pretty big stressors in a cow's environment. And so the benefit of Enforce beyond an injectable vaccine, beyond the three components of a vaccine that are in it, is its ability to boost the immune system. So all vaccines take a healthy immune system because they have to respond and create antibodies. Enforce has an additional component to it that upregulates the immune system, not just to the vaccine, but upregulates the immune system in general, right? So it's kind of like an immune boost. So we'll have people that will do that prior to shows, prior to stressors like group calving or group penning, things like that, traveling, stuff like that. So timing, AJ, maybe this will answer that question. Timing of modified live vaccines. So most vaccines require 2 doses. Vaccines need to be about 4 weeks apart. They can be as little as 2, and I think they say up to 6 months to still get that, what they call amnestic response. So you get your wave on your graph, and then before it tails down too far out, you get that second one, and it gets you a much higher peak. So that's what you're looking to get. And there's a window there, but most vaccines will say about 4 weeks later. That really is necessary to prime the immunity. Now, different herds may have different requirements, and this is why I recommend you talk to your veterinarian. But as a general rule, some guidelines would be at weaning. So we vaccinate calves when we wean them. That gives you a window somewhere in the 8 to 9 month. If we vaccinate too early, what happens is the antibodies from mom circulate in the calf's immune system, or circulate in the calf's body. The antibodies then that are already there from mom interact with the vaccine, and basically they don't respond to it, right? They didn't have to. So anytime in my understanding at least, you know, we have vaccines that come in series, like that's pretty common in dogs, right? Part of the reason that we do that is because we don't know when the antibodies from mom will run out, right? So we don't technically know when is the perfect time, because it'll vary, right? It depends on the animal. When does mom's antibodies run out, and when do I need to start creating my own antibodies to the environment I'm in or may be exposed to? And so since that varies, we have like series, right? Puppy series, right? We don't know. But in cattle, calves will be able to respond to a vaccine generally before 8 to 9 months. But there's not usually a lot of reason to pull them off pasture and run them through. There's not usually a lot of extra stressors. Now, if you're going to go to shows, if you got other things, there might be a reason to vaccinate sooner. But there's, as a general rule, in a closed herd, you got your cows out on pasture, there's really no reason to bring them in early, vaccinate them, and kick them back out. So at weaning is generally sufficient. So that'd be Then again, 4 weeks later, and your cows, depending on your setup, and we talked a little bit about timing, your cows you can vaccinate with a modified, or sorry, your cows you can vaccinate with a killed vaccine at preg check, right? But if you want to use a modified live, the best place to put that in is after they calve and before they get bred. The immune system of a cow drops after they calve. Their immune system is down around the time of calving. That's normal. So we don't want to vaccinate a cow for at least 21 days after they calve. So basically just figure about a month, right? But 21 days is like the minimum. So in order for them to properly respond to a vaccine, it won't hurt them. You just won't get as much benefit from it. You know, that curve we were talking about, you want it to get as high as possible and last as long as possible. So, and then the other thing to keep in mind on a modified live vaccine is you don't want to give it within 2 weeks of breeding, because some modified live vaccines will also have a component of, how do I say it? Basically, it can affect the follicle wave, right? And the follicle wave is what's necessary on the ovary prior to breeding. So modified live vaccines can have an effect on the follicle wave. So you wouldn't want to do that within 2 weeks. So, sometimes, you can sit down and look at a calendar and kind of think, put it in where it works best for you. Ask your vet. I can't speak for everybody, but some places, some vets will have, like a charge. It might be a flat fee to put a vaccine protocol together for you. But sometimes you get what you pay for too. And if you have a vet come out and, kind of explain the operation and what's going on, sometimes they can tailor it to you. And sometimes that's a better option. But this, like I said, this is kind of a ballpark. It's going to work for a lot of people. And it certainly gets you going in the right direction. So.
Matt, did you have a question there?
Everyone's muted.
Yeah, I was trying to allow them there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got time here. I think that I only have a couple more slides. So if you guys have questions, please jot them down here and be ready to, unmute yourself and we'll come back to you.
Okay, Matt said you're good to go ahead and move on.
All right. Killed vaccines, same idea. 2 doses, 4 weeks apart initially. After that, they're annual vaccines. You can use it weaning and 4 weeks later, same way. The benefit we already talked about is you can give it to pregnant cows. So, or if you have cows, calves intermingled and it's becoming complicated, for safety's sake, go to a killed vaccine. So that's kind of my little spiel on vaccines, and I'm happy to come back to it for your questions or anything. I think this is the last slide. Yeah. There was a couple questions on deworming. So I put this in here. I know it's a little bit outside the scope of vaccines, but in general, we try to limit how much we deworm in our, what we want to call our natural with management environment, whatever we're doing here. As a general rule, a lot of us are trying to limit how much we use antibiotics, chemicals, hormones, maybe no hormones at all. A lot of people aren't using those at all. So there'll be some cattle that'll struggle too. So some cattle, there's a genetic component to parasite resistance. Your genetics, your environment, what you're breeding for, but rotational grazing will help, right? So the idea behind that is the egg drop to larva hatch is about 4 to 5 days. So when those eggs drop and hatch, we've got 4 to 5 days. Now, if you're looking at paddock moves, you don't want to be And I know some guys have taken this to fantastic levels of moving cattle like every hour. I don't have an intern on my farm. That's just not going to work for me. And my kids are getting bigger, but I don't think they're going to move cows every hour for me yet. So that's fantastic, right? You can do great things, and guys are pushing the limits on some of this. Well, maybe they're not even pushing the limits yet. We thought they were, but on some of this, what do they call it now? Just really intensive, high level grazing, as far as mob grazing. There we go. But in general, if you're not quite so progressive, you still don't want to leave them in the same spot more than probably about 3 days, right? Because 4 to 5 days is when those larvae hatch, and you want them off of there. Then the larvae themselves, obviously, probably most of you are aware of this, but they'll climb up the plant. That's how the life cycle works. They get re-ingested and then passed in the manure. So, and then the eggs get passed in the manure. So once they're on that, once they're passed in the manure, you get the cows off. They hatch in the next day or two. Your cows are out of there, hopefully. So that's already going to start reducing the numbers in your herd. Now the larvae are on there for about 4 to 6 weeks. Now this becomes a little bit challenging, because I know there's some people that are only doing, depending on how much land they have, they're putting them back in about 30 days later. So there is still some risk to that. If you can get to 60 days, that's pretty fantastic, and you'll see some benefits from a parasite management standpoint, potentially. The other factor is how we graze, right? So if we are grazing the top part of the plant, that also helps to reduce that to some extent, but those larvae will climb. So it's not a perfect system if we're putting them in early. But certainly keeping them from grazing too low to the ground is also a factor. So yeah, the other thing too, I just want to mention, we're at a point in dewormer use where we're actually starting to see some resistance. And Ivomec came on the scene in the 1970s. So, and it was an amazing product, right? I mean, it's been used to death, and it still works, but we're starting to get to the point where we're having some disease, parasite resistance to Ivomec, specifically in our small ruminants, such as sheep and goats. Now that's becoming a much bigger issue, but even starting to see it some in cattle. And we kind of, as an industry, we use this product a lot, and so between its age and the way it was used, we're kind of getting at a point where we're going to have to start recognizing that we need to be careful with the products we have. So I don't necessarily think that all cattle just need to be dewormed, spring and fall. That was pretty common. Cows can handle a small load of parasites. I would recommend going more off body condition and hair coat and some of those things. We can always test for it too. I know it's pretty easy to, in our world of, quick solutions, is just to pour them, just it's done. But there's the opportunity to do fecal testing to see if it's even needed. And then there you may have a herd that looks great except for a cow or two, and it's okay to spot treat. Not everyone necessarily needs it, right? So spot treating an animal is okay, and then maybe she kind of goes on your watch list. Maybe she doesn't spend the rest of her life at your farm. Maybe maybe you're working for genetics that do better in your environment, and that is a genetic factor. So another thing to consider too is, what effects do these insecticides, so they're basically insecticides, what effect do they have on the pass-through? So on the manure pats, the insects in the soil, specifically as it refers to dung beetles, right? Because dung beetles have two factors. They get rid of the manure piles out of our fields, but they also limit future flies. And dewormers do have an effect on the dung beetle. So that is something to keep in mind. If you do need to deworm, I would encourage you to do it in the spring or the fall, but do it when they're off pasture. If you need to do, if you need to do your herd, or if you need to do a couple cows in your herd before, I'd recommend you do it before you put them on pasture, because we're trying to keep the levels low in the pasture, parasite levels low. It'll depend a little bit on the product you use. There's a number of different porons, injectables, orals for parasites and fly control. But we're probably looking at a minimum of 14 days, and probably safer to plan, because there's a range and it depends on your product, up to 30 days before they go out. So if you've got a barnyard or a sacrifice lot, doing that about a month before you put them out on your pastures is ideal. And that helps limit the amount in the environment on your pastures. So that was a little bit of a tail on into the vaccines discussion, but that's what I've got for slides today. Are there questions I can answer? I don't guarantee to know all the answers, but we can probably find them.
I was just teasing Bob because you've been answering these questions as you've been going along without even me asking these questions.
Well, perfect.
So yeah. Hey, would you mind talking about pink eye remedies? I think many of us have had our experience with pink eyes, and I'm just kind of curious on remedies.
Yeah. So truth
prevention.
Is, what's that?
I said, or prevention. You know, how good is the vaccine?
Yeah. Truth is, it affects all of us, right? So I got home from a Red Devon Association meeting and went out the next day, and one of my calves got some streaming, squinty eye and some streaming down the side. So it affects us all. So there's a couple of things. There are vaccines for pink eye. There's a number of, I can't speak to veterinarians in your area, but around here we do a couple different things. So there's two different types, two different primary types of pink eye. And we were pretty used to pink eye showing up in the summer, right? You see the flies around the face, and the irritant, and that was pretty common. Flies going from cow to cow. Then we started seeing pink eye in the winter, right? And that just seemed, honestly, I don't know all the mechanism of that. I think that one's, I'm not going to say it. There's two different, they've got special names, but I can't remember which is which. So but we started seeing it in the winter, and I don't know the specific mechanism. As far as I know, it's still spread cow to cow some way or another, but obviously the flies are less of a factor. So the options are take both of those vaccines and vaccinate with both of them, but not a lot of guys really like doing that. There's what's called an autogenous vaccine, which means, and it's something we've done. We have, one of the options when we go out to take a look at cows with pink eye is to use a swab, and we send it out. It's Newport Laboratories. Basically what they do is they manufacture a vaccine, and they'll take the isolates from the swabs that we do, and they'll do a combination, right? So if the farms in our area, if they get multiple different types, they'll put all those into the same vaccine, and so it becomes what's called an autogenous vaccine from the exact types of pink eye that our farms are seeing in this area. and that seemed to be pretty effective. With the winter pink eye that we see, time of year might not be quite as helpful, but as a general rule, the idea was to vaccinate with pink eye prior to there being much of a problem with flies, so early spring, and that would still be appropriate. It's sometimes you'll see it and it'll go through and get a few, and other years you just won't have any trouble with it at all. So it's a little bit hard to know. If it's something you've struggled with, it's probably much cheaper to vaccinate. But if you're a small herd and you see a cow every couple of years, maybe you decide to treat instead. So we'll talk about the options for treating. Historically, what we did And cows hated this, I'll tell you. But you'll understand why. We would roll down the eyelid and roll up the eyelid both and inject antibiotics into the conjunctiva. So that's the pink part around the eye, right? And they hated it, but it worked really well. So what would happen is when we'd inject antibiotics right into that portion, one, it's right next to it, but also it would ooze a little bit out of the injection site, like the needle track, right? And so you kind of get this bathing of the eye. That worked really well, but it was difficult, right? Not every farm has a good headlock, and even still, it was an issue, right, for restraint. So that was pretty common, but that's a decade ago. I don't feel like I should be old enough to say that, but I guess time keeps marching by. Anyway, so what we kind of started doing, and let me back up, in dairy systems too, where guys were treating cows, had the opportunity to be face-to-face with cows regular. Some people would put stuff right in the eye, right? Just a little squirt of antibiotic right in the eye. That helps, but it has to be done often. There's another product called Vaccinations. It's not an antibiotic, but it promotes healing, and it's a spray, and you can find that at the farm stores. And my understanding is that it works pretty good. I've tried it. The problem is they get tired of it, right? So unless you're bringing them through a restraint every day, it starts to get better, and then you can't catch the calf anymore, type thing. And so I think it needs a prolonged course for that to be real effective. And if you have a way to do that, great. Also, the level of pink eye, right? And we see this sometimes. So we'll show up on farm, and you got just a little bit. So what happens first is the eyeball doesn't even look too different, maybe a little bit cloudy, but they're squinting, and you got the running eye, just like they have something in the eye. If you catch it, then the sooner you catch it, the better those kind of spray products have better chance they have of working. Also, you can use cheaper antibiotics. So for example, LA200 is an injectable antibiotic. You can treat pink eye in that stage with LA200, and it's cheap. It's an irritant. They often get a lump where you inject them, but it works. If you've either waited or missed, it happens. You never saw the right side of the cow, and finally today you saw the other side, and you realize what that might have been going on longer than I realized, right? And that can happen. But if the eye is ulcerated, so it's white, you got this white center now, it's kind of protruding out a little bit, red around it. They'll go blind. Those are the ones you want to treat with a little more high-powered antibiotic, because it tends to work quicker. And I'm not guaranteeing you'll always get them back. It depends on how far gone it is, because they'll actually ulcerate out, they'll rupture the eyeball, and they'll go blind. But if you can catch it early, you can use something like LA200 if you want to. But even then, the two products I use are usually Draxxin and Exceed. So Exceed is a ceftiofur. The benefit for that is it'll be a little bit cheaper than Draxxin on a full-size cow. And also, I do a lot of dairy work, and ceftiofurs have no milk hold, right? So guys love that. Draxxin works great. It's going to be a little bit pricey on an adult cow, but it works, and it works well, and it works fast. So those are the two products I use the most. I've used something like LA200 in one of my own that I was watching, and honestly, that's where I get a little bit of my my data, my stories, I guess, because as a veterinarian, we go treat cows, but sometimes we never get to see how it works. Because as long as it's working, they don't call us back. On my own, I've tried both Draxxin, excuse me, and LA200, and that was my experience. The LA200 worked. It just seemed to be a more prolonged time of recovery. So
I was just looking at this Exceed product. It says, that's from Zodius?
Yep, Zoetis,
Or
correct.
Zoetis, okay. Is that it is like an injectable intramuscular or sub-Q or?
So that one's curious because it's the only product that is designed to be injected in the fat pad at the base of the ear. So when they came out with that product, so there's three different ceftiofurs: Naxel, XNL, and Exceed. They're all basically the same. One is long acting, that's Exceed. That's why it's beneficial for pink eye, right? You only have to do one injection. XNL is multiple, it's a daily injectable, and Naxel is a powder water combination that you mix and then use. They're all basically the same. But when Exceed was formulated, it's the only one that's long acting of the three. And their label, their testing and label claim came out with a injection site at the base of the ear. So when you squeeze the base of a cow's ear, just past like the kind of the cartilage lines of the ear, you can usually grip something that's, depending on how fat the cow is, about 1.5 inches, well, actually probably more like 2 inches. It's ahead of the skull and behind the cartilage, and that's the fat pad, and that's where it's designed to be injected. And the reason for that is because, at least my understanding is, when you have a carcass down the road, the injection site is completely removed off the carcass. So that's part of the way the holds were designed, is the fact that the injection site is completely removed prior to any prior to using the carcass. So other than that, I don't really know how they came up with that idea, but that's the idea behind it. So Exceed is a single shot, long acting, goes at the base of the ear, and it works for pink eye. Draxin is a sub-Q shot. It goes generally, beef quality assurance guidelines recommend all vaccine, or all, well, vaccines should too, but all injections be given ahead of the shoulder, out of the prime cuts. So sub-Q Draxin ahead of the shoulder, inside of the neck.
So
that's also a long-acting single injection.
That Exceed product, what else could it be used for aside from treating pink eye?
Its primary label is, if I remember correct, it's certainly respiratory, but I think and also foot rot. I think those are the two claims on there. There might be more, but specifically pneumonia antibiotic and foot rot. So it gets into a lot of tissue pretty well. Oh, it's also been labeled for metritis. So uterine infections. Exceed is labeled for uterine infections, but they did change it slightly in that it requires 2 doses. So if you're treating metritis or a stinky uterus, you give 2 injections 72 hours apart.
Yeah, thanks.
Days. Yeah.
I'd never heard of that product, so thanks for doing that.
Yeah, it's probably more common in the dairy world, but it works really well, and it works on beef cows just as well as it does on dairy cows. So
sounds good. I got 2 more questions here, and then we'll finish up because we're getting over time. But
sure.
Carolyn asked, is there any other vaccine you would want to give if you were taking an animal off your farm, for example, taking it to a show or a bull test?
Okay. Your virals and your leptos and your clostridiums are still your primary ones. The only thing I might do in addition to those, so okay, so it probably goes without saying, but if you're going across state lines, sometimes there's other requirements, right? So, and sometimes bull tests or shows, sometimes these events or locations they can dictate their own requirements. So follow up with those 2. But I'm just trying to think, and not that I can think of. So, well, I guess it depends on what you're going to do. So there's a vaccine for Vibrio, which is a venereal disease in cattle, right? And bulls can get it and carry it and transmit it. So that would be something, depending on what you're doing, that I would consider And there's a product, Bovishield, which is Zoetis. Bovishield carries a product. I think it is your virals and your leptos with Vibrio. I'm pretty sure they have a combination product like that. So that'd be something to consider. Other than that, still the primary ones I recommended. One thing I'll circle back to, part of the reason we recommend the modified live with the timing to be pre-breeding is because we want those, obviously it does take more management than just giving a killed vaccine anytime we want to, right? But part of the reason is we want that cow to have the highest level of resistance to these type of diseases, specifically things that cause abortions. But then again, keep in mind that any incident that causes high fever, which almost any pneumonia can, increases their chance for abortion, so high fever. So we want these levels to be high, the antibody levels to be highest when the pregnancy is most susceptible. And as a general rule, across species, your first 30 days of any pregnancy are your most susceptible time, right? So that's the other reason, even though it's an additional management to time everything out properly, if we can give these vaccines prior to breeding, that's ideal. It takes about 2 weeks for cows to go from an injection to having antibodies. Okay, so plus there's that window of time where we don't want to get too close for the follicle wave. We talked about that. But if we can give cows vaccines, a month before we're trying to breed them, that's ideal for getting those levels up high in their system. So just to go back to Carolyn's question, even though it's the same basic vaccines, and maybe look into Vibrio, depending on what you're doing, especially if it's a bull that's getting rented out or something, having these vaccines boosted before this time of stress is ideal. So when you do it, trying to make sure those levels are high again. Other than that, in-force, okay? We talked a little bit about that. It doesn't matter, okay, if a cow is already vaccinated and she's good to go or he's good to go, but now we're 3-4 days from shipping somewhere, right? You can give that in-force product. It's an intranasal. The fact that it has those 3 vaccine components, BRSV, PI3, and IVR, it's not going to hurt to give those again, even if they had enough injectable vaccines that those should be all set, right? It won't hurt anything. The reason to do it is for that immune boost, and that's appropriate to do ideally about 3 to 4 weeks before you, or 3 to 4 days, before you leave.
And that's not based on weight, right? It's always just, is it always just 2 or 2.5?
It is always just the dose of that vaccine. Trying to remember, I think it's 2 cc's.
That's what whatever it is.
But whatever it is on the package, it doesn't matter. It's not weight dependent. So
yep, sounds good. Then the other question I had is when cows are overwintered in a barn sacrifice, can they still get worms?
Yes. Yeah, but not quite as smoothly and as pretty as the picture. The picture has this life cycle, the cow, comes out in the manure, a few days later climbs up the grass, the next cow comes along, great. We've got the system going on. So in a feedlot, a couple of things, right? One, we're not guaranteed that the dewormer knocks out everything, right? So if you're struggling with parasites and you've brought them in the fall and dewormed them, and now you're looking at spring, whether or not you should do it again, you're right in that the risk should be less. Like there shouldn't really be a lot of reason to do it in the fall and again in the spring, but it's not they can still spread it and get it. And the reason is because unless your system's better than most people, there's still fecal contamination in feed from time to time. There's still fecal contamination in the water from time to time. And so while it's not, that pretty picture of the larva on the grass, there's still the primary way it's transmitted is fecal oral, right? So it's in the poop and it gets in the mouth. So that happens at the feed bunk and that happens in the water. That happens with calves nursing dirty teats, cows licking themselves or each other. So yes, it still happens. Maybe less, but it still happens.
Okay. And then we had last one here is, would you share your opinion on castration, the method, and at what age?
Yes, I will. I've been called out to castrate some pretty big calves. Maybe we should call them young bulls. And you can, right? But your risk goes up. So as the testicles grow, so does the blood supply. And so it depends a little bit on how you want it done when your window of time runs out. There is like the green band, right? Like the little donut band. You can do that. I've done it. I think I've done it on the day a calf was born. I knew I didn't want it to keep it as a bull. The only thing you have to be careful of as far as early is make sure that both testicles are down, right? And then make sure the scrotum is big enough that there's going to be some pressure, right? So for example, baby goats, we don't. It doesn't take them long, but they need to grow larger testicles for there to be enough pressure because the band is slightly bigger in its relaxed state, right? It's a little too big. So on a calf though, most of the time you can do it right away. That's the little green band. Whenever there's multiple ways to do the same job, it's probably because none of them are perfect. And that's what I tell guys, like we can band them, we can cut them, we can crimp them, we can pull them. But if one way was perfect, there'd be no reason to do multiple. So the band works pretty well on young calves. What happens is they get a little too big and we still try to put well, hopefully we don't, but sometimes guys still try to put the band on. I've seen the green bands used on testicles that were much too large. What happens is there's a vein and an artery. Artery pumps the blood in, veins release it back out for circulation to the body. Arteries are deeper, veins are more superficial. So if you have a clamp on there that's not tight enough or that can't do the job because it's meant for smaller bulls, like the little green band, what happens is blood will keep pumping in, but it can't get out. And they will swell to large proportions, right? And you've got a problem on your hand. Sometimes then the band breaks, but at that point you've got potentially toxic tissue that's now exposed to the bloodstream again. So it can be a real issue on cow health. The other thing is just what do you do with it, right? Like how do you band then this giant problem? Let's call it a giant problem. So that happens. There's crimping. That works actually pretty well. It's a clamp that crimps down, and if you do both cords and you do them separately and you hold it on for about 2 minutes each, it should work pretty good. But there and again, it's a kind of a timing issue. Sometimes you get in a hurry. I don't personally like it, but it does work. The other reason that's a little bit of a challenge is because it doesn't remove the testicles. And then I've shown up at a farm before to castrate an animal, and then you're trying to figure out there's testicles here, but they look a little too small. Is it because he's been crimped, and now they're just not growing properly? So it can be a little tricky. Cutting is also an option if they get too big. Generally, what happens is a cut and pull, kind of like a pig. As the blood supply gets bigger, there's a risk of bleeding to death, honestly, and it does happen sometimes. My method that I use the majority of the time is I band them. There's a product called a Calicrate bander. It's fantastic. It's expensive. But it works really well, and you can do big bulls with it. Now, I don't recommend doing big bulls with it, but I've done, bulls, I don't know, year of age or better, talking 800, maybe 1,000 pounds. That's pushing it. Honestly, it's not ideal. And sometimes we still have problems with those ones, but we try to explain, the kind of the pluses and negatives, and people have to make a decision based on where they're at. If they've waited too long, now what do we do? So I recommend banding. I'm not a cutter. I recommend the green bands. When you can put them on, it's easier, it's less stressful. When you wait till you have a big set of testicles and use the big bander, you're also going to affect rate of gain. It's going to knock them off feed for a little bit. Doesn't mean they won't eat, but they're not growing, they're not thriving for a few days. And then use a tetanus vaccine. So not sure, did I answer all those questions? Probably the long way around it. I've seen some of these things go poorly, right? And timing is a big deal. Oh, the other thing I'll just say, because I see this too, we get called out to fix what's called short sack bulls. So they put a band on, but only banded one testicle, and so now the scrotum's gone, so you can't band it anymore, but one testicle is still there. So the other thing I say is you only have to be able to count to 2. So when you get done, make sure there's 2 nuts below the band and you'll be good to go.
That's great, Darren. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks for taking time away from your family and your evening to help us out with this.
You're welcome.
Yeah, a lot of good information there. So I appreciate that. It's going to be recorded and we'll have it up for others as well. So
perfect.
Thanks. You have a good night. Look forward to doing it again. Everyone else, check your emails, and we'll give you a date in April when we're going to do those other webinars. Like I say, I think it's going to be probably like mid-April and then beginning of May, I would suspect, for the rest of it. So
okay.
Well, thanks. Have a good night there.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.